Okay, so this is the student movement, but I want you guys to understand that the student movement was occurring. It's not separate, like from the civil rights. It's like concurrent to the civil rights. And I want you guys to be able to identify the reasons for the protests that occurred in the '60s by the students. So we talked about this when we talked about the '50s, and we talked about how teenagers were different than their parents, like generationally. Like they had different language, different tastes in music, different tastes in movies. And the '60s really sees that difference between generations like come to fruition. So the government was being changed. Well, society was changing the government, because if you think about it, Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement was putting political pressure on the government through social action, like protests, sit-ins, all the things that you went over in civil rights. So for the teens, their issues were not race-based; it was age-based. But the Vietnam War was starting to ramp up in the 1960s, and there was a draft to get people to go over to fight. And so the age of people who are drafted it begins at 18, and then it just continues to go up from there. So students were angry about this because they didn't see the reason to be, drafted, sent overseas to Vietnam to fight a war that they didn't necessarily understand. And the other thing that you had to understand about all this is all happening in the context of the Cold War. So you've got the American led West versus the Soviet led East, and nobody's really sure how to handle this necessarily. Like, many people just sort of dismissed the students. They derogatively called them like hippies. People still use that term to this day. So there's lots of things going on. There was a lot of drug use, a lot of this generation in the 50s into the 60s. They're very different than their parents. So if we look at what was wrong with American society and we were to rank them in order of importance, we have the following things. Okay, there's a growing amount of poverty in inner cities, especially among minority groups. So African Americans, Latinos, etc. Black people and other minority groups had their rights denied. You could see this by people being arrested in the '60s demonstrations. You have a right to assembly. That's part of the First Amendment. So people felt like their rights were being denied. Plus, according to the law, African Americans had the right to vote, and yet in the South, African Americans were being denied the ability to even register to vote, let alone vote. Women were really treated as second-class citizens. They were expected, and we talked about this in the '50s, but they were expected to stay home, be obedient to their husbands, and raise their children. While women had served in World War II, like they took over the jobs of men. They were welders. They flew airplanes. They didn't want to stay home, and they did do it for a while. But by the '60s, the resentment had grown to the point where people were they were ready for a change. They didn't want to remain the way that they had. And then there was a fear of a nuclear holocaust, since you've got both the United States and the Soviet Union, who have now created intercontinental ballistic missiles. And there is this real fear that ever since what happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there would, like, civilization as we know it would be wiped out. So people were afraid of that. And then there's disillusionment with the growing consumer culture, meaning people buying things, advertisements. Like, we live in a world in which advertisements are everywhere, but that was just getting started in the '50s and '60s. And people were not so happy with it. And then last is the 1950s American society. It had this really strict social and moral expectations, and we talked about them. And whenever that happens, you're going to have, at least at some point, a break where people are going to reject that sort of control. So the baby boom, it occurred after World War II. This is when large numbers of people were born, and they're affluent because in the 50s and the 60s, the United States was helping to rebuild the rest of the world and making a lot of money off of it. So these young people, as we've already mentioned before, they were influenced by things like rock and roll, but they also drank a lot. Teenagers got into gangs and rebellions, and I'm talking about like there's a lot of like really popular things that come out of this. Like there's a musical called West Side Story, and it's about rival gangs, and so there's like a romanticization of this, but in reality, these gangs could cause a lot of problems. I mean, they had switchblades, they brought chains, they fought at each other, and people did get hurt, and sometimes people died. So when the war ended, in the United States returned to a period of prosperity, which it hadn't seen since the end of the First World War. The U.S. becomes this place of what are called WASPs, and you'll still hear this term used today. And WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and it's mostly applies to men. And you can see this. So, like, this is an engineering firm, and you can see it's white Anglo-Saxon, meaning people of British descent, and they're Protestants. They're not Catholics. So when President Kennedy was running for president and was elected in 1961, he promised to create a fairer, more equal society. There's a lot of things about him that are interesting. I mean, he is the first Catholic president we've had. He ran against President Dwight Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon, and it was the first televised debate. And the people who watched the televised debate felt that Kennedy had won. The people who had listened on the radio, they felt that Nixon had won. So it shows that visual appearance can make a difference in swaying people in people's opinions and things like that. He's going to be assassinated in 1962, and this is going to unleash a wave of anger and disillusionment with many young people because they felt that, he's this guy who promised to lead them into the United States into some like new type of society, one that's going to be more progressive, and he was killed for that. Then we have this thing called counterculture, and this is directly against the 1950s. These are people who are going to do all kinds of interesting things, and they want to make sure that the younger generation know that they're not with them. So this is when you'll get peace signs and rainbows. Women will stop shaving their armpits and legs. They'll burn their bras. Men will grow their hair long and grow beards. A lot of marijuana smoking and LSD and other drugs. So it's quite a time. African American men and women grew afros. And these people, and by no means is this like 100% of the youth, but it's a sizable amount of people. They demanded freedom for everything. Music, clothes, they should be able to wear what they want, social life, sexual relations. People had open relationships, and it was very, very different than what the expectations had been in the decades preceding the 1960s. One of the things that helped fuel this is the pill was created, and this allows women who take the pill, at that time looks like this, to control whether or not they become pregnant. And there were always methods of avoiding pregnancy or dealing with a pregnancy that was unwanted, but this is a completely different thing. This is a simple pill that you take, and a woman can now engage in sex with men, and it's not 100%, but it's very close to 100% of not getting married. Not having children, and this changes the dynamic between men and women. So these attitudes, they're fueled by this growing sense of freedom that the young have, and the ultimate expression of this freedom is the hippie movement, which it's a nationwide movement, but it's really, if you're looking for a capital, it would be San Francisco specifically. And they emphasize like the playing of music, the use of drugs, peace, meaning not fighting in Vietnam, getting rid of nuclear weapons, free love, and then communal living. And some of these things worked, and some of these things did not work so well. At the universities, though, there's a difference as well, because there's this access to universities that young people have because of things like the GI Bill, and these people are all brought together, and they're different. There's going to be like two different groups of people in universities. There will be conservatives and there will be liberals, and they're going to come to a head, but they're an important part of the counterculture. One group will be anti-war, and one group will be pro-war. One of the things, though, that students, regardless of their political affiliation, demand at the university is they want a greater say in their education. They don't want to just pay to be told what to learn. They want to have choice. And they're going to question their professors. They're going to question the institution of education. And as a result of this, in the 1960s, we're going to see changes. They'll begin to do gender studies. They'll do minority studies. So there'll be Latino, African American, African, all kinds of things that had always been on the fringe will now come into the mainstream, as will studies on drugs, as will gender and sexuality, things that, it's not as if these things didn't exist. It's just that they weren't talked about. And at the university level, they will be. Students will go on strike, meaning they'll not go to class. They'll sit in hallways. They'll occupy buildings like the dean's office or the administration. They'll come in and they'll sit down and they'll chant songs and things like that. They'll hold demonstrations. They'll hold rallies. And this does not just occur like in California, but it's like everywhere. It's from California to New England. Then we have these group of people who are protest singers, some of whom I hope you've heard of. Like this is Jimi Hendrix, you heard of the Beatles, and this is Bob Dylan. But some of them are around in the 50s, but it's in the 60s that there's this explosion, and this is where the term pop music comes from. So we still have pop music to this day, but what they are is they're artists that express youth culture. They're artists that the youth like, that they can identify with. And often their messages and their songs are about protest, not necessarily openly. Sometimes it's like subliminal, but not always. Sometimes it's right in your face. So we've got the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and then Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan. They all sang themes about like nuclear war and its danger and why we should get rid of nukes, racism, sex, drugs, and opposition to the war. And when I say opposition to the war, I mean specifically the Vietnam War. Then we have Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of young Americans, their first experience with protest and civil unrest was their involvement in the Civil Rights Movement, or they're watching it on television after dinner with their families because this was reported every night. And they saw what the Civil Rights Movement was trying to achieve and how it was achieving those goals, and so they adopted those. But there were also scenes of violence against peaceful protesters. Water cannons were used. German Shepherds were set on people. Police used their bully sticks and beat people. So, people were inspired, but they were also realistic in the sense that they knew that by putting themselves out there, the protesters could be placing themselves in harm. However, no matter what kind of damage was done to you, even up to death, it could lead to change because the Civil Rights Movement does actually have real fruit that happens. So a lot of white students are going to take part in these freedom marches. They're in the freedom rides, Freedom Summer, the sit-ins, and they take these things back with them to their universities, and then they say things like, well, why are we learning this, or why aren't we learning that? And they know how to move the levers of power, which is they know how to march, sit in, disrupt, and get things that they want. The big thing, though, too, is the Cold War. So the Cold War in the 60s is a big deal because if you remember, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the closest point at which the United States and the Soviet Union had come to engaging in a hot war. But fortunately, both sides backed down. But now it's starting to ramp up again. The tensions between the communists and the capitalists, and so the United States doesn't really want to back down in Vietnam. And as a result, we are spending ever increasing amounts of money on the war effort in Vietnam, and then we begin to send. At first, it's dozens, and then it's hundreds, and then it's thousands, and then it's tens of thousands of soldiers over to Vietnam. And the longer the war took, the more American deaths there were. So newspapers were still a thing, but the big thing was television news. And so you had reporters who were going to places like Vietnam, and they were interviewing troops. there wasn't as much control over access for the media to these soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. And sometimes these sailors and soldiers, etc., they told them, the reporters, exactly how they felt. And, some of these people, they were drafted. They didn't want to come to Vietnam. They had to stay there for a year. And they were doing all kinds of crazy things. Like Air Force pilots were dropping napalm on jungles, on villages. I mean, just wanton death. They didn't really necessarily understand why were they dropping napalm on hills. The soldiers were going into places that they were supposed to be protecting, or people they're supposed to be protecting, and then they were burning their villages. So it kind of creates this like dissidence, like, well, how are you saving the people by burning their possessions? And then the civilian death toll, which was caused by the U.S., begins to rack up. And so many people, including the soldiers that were fighting the war, they felt that they weren't the liberators of the South Vietnamese people, but they were the oppressors of the South Vietnamese people. And it really changed things. So the Vietnam War was not like World War II, and it was not like the Korean War at all. Part of the reason why was its length. It was a very long war. And then also the people that fought it. It was mainly the young. It was not people in their late 20s, early 30s, 40s, like in the war, in the Second World War. This was mainly people 18 and over who were doing the fighting, and they were drafted, and they didn't want to be drafted necessarily. So some went so far as to do what this gentleman's doing, and this gentleman, which is burning the draft card, which is it's against the law. All right. So it says, use source B and your own knowledge to explain why protest movements were so active in the 60s. It says the war that dominated the United States in the 1960s was the anti-communist war in Vietnam. The U.S. government could call up men as young as 17 years to fight in Vietnam for 2 years. Those same young men were not seen as responsible enough to vote until they were 21. At this time, you couldn't vote until you were 21. Okay? So what this wants you to do, this is also in the textbook, but it wants you to underline keywords, events, and people in the source that you can write more about. So if we were to look at this, right, we would know what anti-communism is. In the anti-communist war, in this case it's Vietnam, so we should underline those things. We got Vietnam again. How long is the draft? These people are expected to serve for 2 years in Vietnam. What's the age? It's 17 years. I mean, some of you are 15, maybe even 16 years old. Can you imagine if you were expected to give up 2 years of your life to go fight? And then this is a big deal right here. I would highlight, circle, whatever, the age 21. Now, you don't have to do this. This is just if I gave you this prompt in school, and we're not in school, so you don't have to worry about it. But so you could be sent to fight for 2 years. You're 17. When you come back, if you lived, you're 19. You still can't vote for 2 more years. That doesn't seem right. And that is the reason why we have an amendment change, which changes the voting age from 21 to 18. All right. And that is it for the war on the first part of the student protests.